Los Angeles International Airport, March 21, 1976. A routine baggage inspection became one of the most bizarre incidents in rock and roll history. David Bowie, the world's most famous chameleon, stood in a sterile interrogation room for 6 hours while federal agents photographed the contents of his luggage. What they discovered wasn't just cocaine or marijuana. Inside those expensive leather cases lay something far more disturbing, something that would create a 200-page FBI file that remained classified for 40 years. The Thin White Duke had arrived in America, but the man they detained that day barely resembled the glam rock icon the world thought they knew. If you want to discover the untold stories behind music's greatest legends, stories that never made it into the official biographies, subscribe to our channel. Because what happened in that airport detention room revealed a side of David Bowie that terrified even those closest to him. The Boeing 747 touched down at LAX just after 2 in the afternoon, California sunshine flooding through the terminal windows. David Bowie had been awake for approximately 72 hours, his system coursing with cocaine, cigarettes, and nothing else. For the past 6 months, he had maintained what his assistant Corinne Schwab later described as the milk and peppers diet, consuming almost no solid food, existing in a state of chemically induced paranoia that had transformed him from Ziggy Stardust into something darker, more fragile, more dangerous. The Thin White Duke persona wasn't just a stage character anymore. It had consumed him entirely. He wore a black suit, white shirt, and his hair was slicked back in a severe style that made him look like he'd stepped out of a Weimar Republic photograph. Dark glasses concealed eyes that hadn't seen natural sleep in days. Behind him, his entourage moved through customs with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times. But something was different that day. Security had been tipped off. Someone, somewhere, had made a phone call. And when Bowie's luggage hit the conveyor belt for the standard customs X-ray, an alarm went off that would change everything. The customs officer, a man named Richard Hernandez, who'd worked at LAX for 12 years, saw something on the screen that made him pause. Not drugs, though he'd find those later. Not weapons, something else entirely. He made a hand signal to his supervisor, and within minutes, David Bowie was being quietly escorted away from his entourage, away from the crowds, into a small room with no windows and fluorescent lights that made everyone look like corpses. The door closed. The detention had begun, and what would emerge over the next 6 hours would shock even seasoned federal agents who thought they'd seen everything. They opened the first suitcase carefully, methodically, photographing everything. Designer clothes, nothing unusual there. Makeup cases, expected for a performer. Then they found the books. Not ordinary tour reading material, not novels or magazines. The first volume they pulled out was a rare German edition of Mein Kampf, annotated in Bowie's handwriting. The margins were filled with notes, underlines, question marks. One agent, whose name remains redacted in the FBI files, later wrote in his report that he felt a chill seeing those annotations, the careful study evident in every marked passage. But that was just the beginning. Beneath the clothes, wrapped in a silk shirt, they found more books. Works by Aleister Crowley, the infamous occultist. Texts on Kabbalah mysticism. A first edition of The Golden Bough, an anthropological study of magic and religion. Tarot cards, not the standard Rider-Waite deck, but something older, hand-painted, possibly 18th century. Crystals, pentagrams drawn on hotel stationery, and a journal filled with symbols that none of the agents could decipher. One officer suggested they might be song lyrics in code. Another thought they resembled ceremonial magic diagrams. They photographed everything, each item carefully logged, and the file grew thicker. Then they found the cocaine. Not a small amount for personal use, but several ounces, professionally packaged, enough to suggest intent to distribute. Marijuana. Prescription medications without prescriptions. Bottles of pills with German labels. But it was the next item that made even the experienced customs agents uncomfortable. Photographs. Dozens of them. Images of Nazi rallies, Hitler youth gatherings, swastikas, concentration camps. Mixed in were pictures of Bowie himself in various poses, some theatrical, some unsettling. And letters, correspondence with people whose names would later be blacked out in the declassified documents, discussing topics that ranged from occult philosophy to political extremism to theories about alien contact and UFOs. The lead agent, a man named Robert Chen, made the decision to contact the FBI. This wasn't just a drug bust anymore. This was something that required federal attention. While they waited for the agents to arrive, Bowie sat in the interrogation room, chain smoking, saying nothing. His lawyer was on the way, but it would take hours. And in that time, David Bowie, exhausted, paranoid, chemically unbalanced, would begin to crack. The thin white Duke facade started to crumble, and what emerged beneath terrified everyone in that room. FBI Special Agent Michael Torres arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon with two colleagues. They'd been briefed on the situation, seen photographs of the luggage contents, and Torres later admitted in a 1998 interview that he expected to find a strung-out rock star. Nothing more. What he found was something else entirely. Bowie sat perfectly still, his movements precise, mechanical. When he spoke, his voice was devoid of emotion, flat, what Torres described as inhuman. This wasn't the flamboyant performer who'd captivated millions. This was someone, something else. The questioning began carefully. Torres asked about the books, the Nazi memorabilia. Bowie's answer was measured, articulate, deeply unsettling. He spoke about his fascination with fascism not as a political ideology, but as a theatrical concept, a study in mass psychology and aesthetic control. He referenced Leni Riefenstahl's films, The Power of Spectacle, the manipulation of crowds through symbol and ritual. He talked about Hitler not as a monster, but as a failed artist who understood the performative nature of power. Torres wrote in his report that Bowie spoke about these topics with the detachment of a scholar, but underneath, there was something else, a genuine attraction to the imagery, the control, the absolute authority of the fascist aesthetic. When they asked about the occult materials, Bowie became animated for the first time. He explained his belief that reality was not fixed, that consciousness could be manipulated through ritual and symbol, that entities existed beyond normal perception. He mentioned Aleister Crowley's concept of true will, the idea that each person has a divine purpose that transcends conventional morality. He described ceremonies he'd performed in hotel rooms, attempts to contact what he called the hidden intelligence behind reality. One agent asked if he meant God. Bowie smiled, the first emotion he'd shown, and said something far older than God, something that existed before human concepts of divinity. The room went silent. Even hardened federal agents felt uncomfortable. But it was when they asked about the cocaine that Bowie truly unraveled. He admitted to consuming massive quantities daily, not for pleasure, but for necessity. He explained that sleep had become impossible, that when he closed his eyes he saw things, visions that terrified him, geometric patterns and faces that weren't human. The cocaine kept him awake. kept him functional, kept the visions at bay. His assistant Corinne would later confirm that Bowie had become convinced his house in Los Angeles was haunted, that he'd covered all the mirrors because he couldn't stand seeing his own reflection, believing it wasn't truly him looking back. The paranoia had reached psychotic levels, and in that airport detention room, federal agents realized they weren't dealing with a simple drug possession case. They were witnessing a complete mental breakdown. By hour 4, Torres and his team faced a dilemma. They had enough evidence to charge Bowie with drug possession, potentially intent to distribute. The Nazi materials, while disturbing, weren't illegal. The occult items were strange but not criminal. But Torres recognized something deeper at play. This was a man in crisis, a human being who'd lost touch with reality through a combination of drug abuse, sleep deprivation, and what Torres suspected was underlying mental illness. Arresting him would create an international incident. Bowie was, at that moment, one of the most famous people on Earth. The media attention would be massive. But more than that, Torres wrote in his notes that he believed Bowie was more a danger to himself than to others. The FBI contacted Bowie's management company. Michael Lipman, Bowie's lawyer, arrived at 6:15 in the evening. Behind the scenes, negotiations began. Bowie would enter treatment, leave Los Angeles, and the charges would be reduced to simple possession with the possibility of being dropped entirely if he cooperated. But there was something else, something that remains partially redacted even in the declassified files. The FBI wanted information about what exactly the documents don't fully reveal. But researchers who've studied the files believe it related to Bowie's connections in Europe, particularly in Germany, and his associations with certain individuals involved in occult organizations that had intelligence agency interest. Bowie agreed to everything. By 8 o'clock that evening, he was released. The contents of his luggage were catalogued, the drugs confiscated, but the books, the photographs, the journals were returned. Someone high up had decided that making this public would serve no purpose. RCA Records, Bowie's label, had made calls. Money changed hands, not as bribes, but as donations to drug enforcement programs. The story was buried. Bowie left the airport through a side entrance, got into a limousine, and disappeared into the Los Angeles night. But the file remained. 200 pages of documents, witness statements, photographs of those bizarre luggage contents, and notes from the interrogation that revealed a man on the edge of complete disintegration. What happened in the weeks following that detention changed David Bowie's trajectory completely. He canceled his remaining Los Angeles commitments and made the decision that would ultimately save his life. He would leave America, leave the cocaine, leave the thin white Duke character behind, and exile himself to Berlin. It wasn't rehab in the traditional sense. It was geographic and psychological escape. Berlin in 1976 was divided, dangerous, a city still haunted by its fascist past and trapped in Cold War tension. For Bowie, it was perfect. A place where he could be anonymous, where the celebrity machine couldn't reach him, where he could attempt to reconstruct his shattered identity. The FBI file remained classified until 2016, 40 years after the incident. When researchers finally gained access through Freedom of Information Act requests, the revelations shocked even longtime Bowie scholars. The extent of his drug use was known. The Nazi flirtations had been publicly addressed. But the depth of his occult obsessions and the severity of his mental state in that period had never been fully documented. Reading those agent reports, seeing the photographs of his luggage contents, understanding just how close Bowie came to complete collapse, recontextualizes everything that came after. The Berlin Trilogy, those three groundbreaking albums, Low, Heroes, and Lodger, weren't just artistic reinvention. They were survival mechanisms, ways of processing trauma and rebuilding a self that had been nearly destroyed. Corinne Schwab, who remained Bowie's assistant and friend until his death, gave an interview in 2007 where she addressed that period. She described finding Bowie in his Los Angeles house, curtains drawn, candles burning, surrounded by books on magic and Nazi imagery, convinced that he was being watched by supernatural entities. She described his weight dropping to dangerous levels, his skin turning gray, his behavior becoming increasingly erratic. The airport detention, she said, was in some ways a blessing. It forced confrontation with a reality Bowie had been trying to escape through drugs and mysticism. It made him realize that the thin white Duke character, that cold, fascist aesthetic he'd been performing, wasn't art anymore. It had become real, and it was killing him. The declassified FBI documents reveal fascinating details beyond the initial detention. The Bureau continued monitoring Bowie for several years afterward, particularly during his time in Berlin. They noted his friendship with Iggy Pop, himself a recovering heroin addict. They documented his movements between West Berlin and various European cities. They recorded associations with artists and musicians, some of whom had connections to left-wing political movements, others to right-wing organizations. The FBI seemed uncertain what to make of Bowie. Was he a drug-addled rock star with dangerous fascinations, or something more complex, an artist exploring the darkest aspects of human nature through his work? One particularly striking document, dated August 1976, describes an interview FBI agents conducted with someone identified only as Source B, whose name remains redacted. This source claimed to have attended a gathering at Bowie's Los Angeles home weeks before the airport detention, where Bowie had performed what he called a ritual involving candles, chanting, and symbols drawn on the floor. According to the source, Bowie claimed he was attempting to summon what he called the hidden masters, entities he believed controlled human destiny. The source stated that everyone present believed Bowie was suffering a psychotic break, that his cocaine use had pushed him into genuine delusion. Yet Bowie spoke with such conviction, such detailed knowledge of occult practices, that some participants felt genuine unease. Another document details the actual contents of Bowie's journal, the one filled with symbols and diagrams. FBI analysts had attempted to decipher it, consulting with experts in cryptography and comparative religion. Their conclusion was that the symbols drew from multiple occult traditions: Kabbalah, Thelema, Golden Dawn ceremonial magic, combined with what appeared to be Bowie's own invented systems. One analyst noted that the journal revealed a brilliant but deeply troubled mind, someone attempting to create meaning and control in a life that had spiraled into chaos. The symbols weren't random. They represented Bowie's attempt to map out a personal cosmology, a way of understanding reality when conventional frameworks had collapsed. Perhaps most disturbing was a letter included in the file, written by Bowie himself sometime in early 1976. The recipient's name is redacted, but the letter's content is preserved. In it, Bowie writes about his belief that he's been chosen for something, that his fame isn't accidental but part of a larger pattern. He references seeing UFOs as a child in England, feeling watched throughout his life, and his conviction that entities are communicating with him through synchronicities and symbols. He writes about Hitler not as a political figure, but as a failed magician who tried to reshape reality through will and spectacle. And he writes about his own fear that he's losing control, that the characters he creates, Ziggy, Aladdin Sane, the Thin White Duke, are becoming autonomous, taking over his consciousness. The letter ends abruptly, mid-sentence, as if Bowie simply stopped writing and walked away. Berlin saved David Bowie's life, though it took months of painful withdrawal and psychological reconstruction. He moved into an apartment with Iggy Pop, two damaged men attempting to heal each other through simple routines and creative work. They rode bicycles through the divided city, ate at Turkish restaurants, visited museums, and slowly, gradually, Bowie began to remember who David Jones had been before the characters took over. The music he created during this period, particularly Low and Heroes, reflected that journey. These weren't rock albums. They were sonic therapy, experiments in ambient sound and fragmented emotion that mirrored Bowie's fractured psyche. The Nazi flirtations ended, though Bowie would spend years afterward apologizing and explaining, trying to contextualize statements he'd made during the cocaine psychosis period. In a 1983 interview with Rolling Stone, he addressed it directly, admitting that he'd become fascinated with fascism's theatrical elements, the power of mass manipulation, but that his judgment had been catastrophically impaired by drugs. He acknowledged the pain his statements had caused, particularly to Jewish fans and Holocaust survivors. It was one of the few times Bowie publicly admitted to real regret, to having crossed lines that weren't artistic, but moral. The occult interests never completely disappeared, but they transformed. In later years, Bowie's fascination became more scholarly, less dangerously obsessive. He collected books on religion and mysticism, but he no longer performed rituals or claimed to communicate with entities. In interviews from the 90s and 2000s, he spoke about that period with a mixture of embarrassment and fascination, as if discussing someone else entirely. Which, in many ways, he was. The thin white duke, that cold, detached persona, had been a kind of possession, a character that took over during the most vulnerable period of his life. When David Bowie died on January 10, 2016, 2 days after releasing his final album Black Star, the FBI file resurfaced in media discussions. Journalists who'd obtained the declassified documents through FOIA requests wrote articles about the airport detention, the bizarre luggage contents, the extent of Bowie's breakdown. But by then, the story had context. Bowie's journey from the depths of addiction and mental illness to the controlled, thoughtful artist of his later years became a narrative of redemption and survival. The airport detention wasn't a scandal anymore. It was the nadir, the moment when everything could have ended, but instead became the catalyst for transformation. Tony Visconti, Bowie's longtime producer and friend, gave an interview in 2017 where he discussed that period. He'd been in Berlin when Bowie arrived, had witnessed the shaking hands and hollow eyes, the man who couldn't sleep and was terrified of his own shadow. Visconti described the recording sessions for Low as therapeutic exercises, creating structure and purpose when Bowie had neither. The ambient instrumental pieces that filled side 2 of the album were Bowie's attempts to quiet his mind, to find peace in sound when words had become inadequate. Every track was a step away from the abyss. The Luggage, those items that shocked FBI agents in 1976, tells a complete story when viewed in retrospect. The Nazi materials reflected Bowie's dangerous flirtation with fascist aesthetics, his cocaine-fueled belief that he could control and manipulate like the dictators he studied. The occult books and symbols represented his desperate attempt to find meaning and power when his own identity had dissolved. The drugs were simply the mechanism of escape and the cause of disintegration. Together, they painted a portrait of an artist who'd pushed too far, explored too deeply, and nearly lost himself completely in the darkness. The FBI agents who detained Bowie that day probably never imagined they were witnessing a turning point in music history. Special Agent Torres retired in 1995 and died in 2003. But in his later years, he gave several interviews about famous people he'd encountered during his career. About Bowie, he said something revealing. He'd expected to find a spoiled rock star, entitled and difficult. Instead, he found a terrified human being who'd gone too far into his own mind and couldn't find the way back. Torres said he'd made the recommendation for treatment rather than prosecution because he recognized someone in genuine crisis, someone who needed help rather than punishment. It was a decision that allowed one of the 20th century's greatest artists to survive and create decades more groundbreaking work. Even with the declassified files, mysteries remain. The redacted sections of the FBI documents, particularly regarding Bowie's associations and the specific nature of the information they sought from him, continue to fuel speculation. Some researchers believe the Bureau was interested in his connections to certain European occult organizations that had intelligence implications during the Cold War. Others suggest they were simply documenting a famous person's bizarre behavior in case it became relevant to future investigations. The truth, like much of Bowie's life, remains elusive. The journal with its symbols and diagrams was returned to Bowie, and according to his estate, was destroyed sometime in the 1980s. Bowie didn't want it preserved, didn't want future scholars analyzing his cocaine-ravaged delusions. But photographs exist in the FBI file, and researchers have studied them extensively. They reveal a mind both brilliant and broken, someone trying to decode reality through a personalized mystical system that mixed genuine scholarship with drug-induced paranoia. It's simultaneously fascinating and heartbreaking, a document of genius in crisis. One question that lingers is what exactly happened in those 6 hours of detention, particularly in the moments not documented in official reports. Other passengers who were at LAX that day later claimed they saw Bowie being escorted through service corridors, looking disoriented and frightened. One flight attendant, who gave an anonymous interview in 2015, said she saw him in the detention area, talking to himself, gesturing at things no one else could see. If true, it suggests Bowie's mental state was even more fragile than the reports indicate, that he was actively hallucinating, trapped between withdrawal and still being high, his consciousness fragmenting in real time. The FBI closed their file on Bowie in 1982, determining he no longer posed any investigative interest. By then, he'd cleaned up, moved back to more commercial music, and was in the process of becoming the elder statesman of rock. The scared, paranoid man detained at LAX was gone, replaced by someone more controlled, more aware of boundaries and consequences. But the file remains, a historical document that reveals how close the music world came to losing David Bowie entirely, how a routine baggage check almost exposed and destroyed one of the most important artists of the 20th century. What most people don't realize is how that airport detention influenced Bowie's subsequent work. Not just the Berlin albums, but everything that came after. Station to Station, the album he was touring when the detention occurred, featured the thin white Duke character at his coldest and most fascist. The songs explored themes of control, detachment, and the allure of absolute power. But after Berlin, after the healing process, Bowie's characters became more human, more vulnerable. Scary Monsters, his 1980 album, featured songs that directly addressed his breakdown, particularly Ashes to Ashes, which revisited Major Tom from Space Oddity, but now trapped in addiction. floating in a tin can with no way home. Even late-period Bowie carried traces of that experience. Black Star, his final album released on his 69th birthday, 2 days before his death, dealt explicitly with mortality and transformation. The title track's video featured Bowie as a blind prophet, surrounded by occult symbols and cosmic imagery. But unlike the 1970s, when those interests nearly destroyed him, now they were under complete artistic control. He'd integrated the darkness, learned to work with it rather than being consumed by it. The scared man in the airport detention room had become the dying artist, leaving a carefully constructed farewell message. The journey between those two moments defined Bowie's entire career.